If you're interested in hearing about the history of the sports card hobby, then this episode is for you. I have two incredible guests today. I have Marshall Fogel, the all-time great collector, and Joe Orlando, the president of PSA for many years and now with Heritage Auctions. And we're going to talk about how sports cards have evolved over the last 35 years, and particularly the business of the hobby. How has grading changed and evolved from its early days to where it is today? How have auction houses changed and evolved from where they started to where we are today? Who were the big movers and shakers that took the hobby through its different phases of growth? And where is it all going to go from here? What will the future of collecting look like? There's no greater people to ask these questions to than Marshall Fogel and Joe Orlando, and I'm sitting down with them now. This episode is brought to you by Heritage Auctions. Whether you're a fan of baseball, basketball, football, or hockey, Heritage Auctions has something for you with an unmatched selection of sports memorabilia. Bid with confidence on everything from autographed jerseys to game-used equipments to trading cards and more. Don't miss a chance to own a piece of sports history and build your collection with Heritage Auctions today. Marshall and Joe, it is an absolute pleasure to sit down with you here today and visit with both of you again. We're here in Marshall's vault, secure vault, just outside of Denver. And it's always a pleasure to get to come here. And today we have Joe joining us. The first time Joe's ever been part of one of our Sports Card Investor or Geoff Wilson Show broadcasts. Hopefully it won't be the last because, Joe, you've got an incredibly rich history in the hobby. You're going to add a lot to the conversation today. I'm really excited about it. For the audience who maybe isn't familiar with you, Joe, why don't you tell them a little bit about your history throughout the hobby?
Well, first of all, I'm excited to be here, so thanks for having me. So I've been a lifelong collector since as far back as I can remember, probably around the age of 4 or 5. In the hobby, as far as working in the hobby, I worked for PSA and what used to be known as Collectors Universe for about 22 years, starting in 1999. Took a little bit of time off after that. I departed from Collectors and have been at Heritage now for about 1.5 years. So I've really enjoyed it. And it's been, I never intended on working in the hobby. It was something I just had a huge passion for, but I'm so glad I made the decision to do it because when you're doing something you love so much, it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah. Was your passion as a collector? Is that what kind of pushed you into actually working in the hobby at the beginning?
Well, I had an opportunity. So I was in law school at the time in my second year, and I had been one of the early supporters of third-party grading in PSA. And so I knew the folks over at PSA, and they had reached out and asked if I would come join the company. And I said, no, I'm in the middle of my education. I think my parents would kill me if I dropped out to do this. And then they reached back out again the following year. It was right around the time of graduation. And I decided at that point, if I were going to try this, that now was the time to do it. And I never looked back. It was never a plan for me. Like I said, it was just something I had a huge passion for, but it's been a great ride.
And I want to hear stories about that because I can only imagine what grading was back then. A lot different than today, just in terms of the acceptance of it in the hobby, the scale of it, all of that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But now you're with Heritage, and Heritage, by the way, has been gracious enough to sponsor this show today. We thank them very much. Heritage Auctions, wonderful auction house. I've spent a lot of money myself at Heritage Auctions, as I know Marshall has, and
we thank you for that.
Many other collectors. And so you really are running the gamut here. You've gone from grading company, biggest and best grading company to now, one of the biggest and best auction houses. You're seeing it from that perspective as well. So you truly are a lifer when it comes to really all aspects of business in the hobby.
Well, it's great to be on the other side of it too. I mean, I joke with people all the time that now I went from making people sometimes sad to happy more often than not, because now we're delivering the collectibles that people desire. And being a collector myself, that's a great feeling to be able to do that. So it really is interesting being on the other side of it now, spending so much time on the third party side.
Yeah, well, that's fun. We're going to dig into that. Marshall, how are you today?
Well, I'm excited to be here. I hadn't seen Joe Orlando for 10 years?
Yes.
And,
oh, wow.
in my opinion, he's one of 4 or 5 people that led us into this coming from, say, a hobby, which it still is, to an industry.
Yeah.
I think Joe Orlando's leadership at Collectors Universe was important and monumental. And so he won't say it, but I always say it to his face. He's a big deal. And for me to be a collector and his being on the corporate side, I think we're going to have a lot of fun talking about the industry. And I happy that Joe went to Heritage Auctions. I know Chris Ivey, whose leadership at the sports division has done a heck of a job. He's a real good guy. He's a nice guy. He's been to my home. We've had dinner together, and so hats off to Chris.
Yeah.
I'm very happy he felt comfortable in sponsoring this interview.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm excited to dig in more because what we're going to cover in today's interview is really a bit of a historical perspective of the hobby and how things have changed over, the last 30 or 40 years. Marshall, I know you've obviously been on the show a number of times before and have told, various stories throughout time. But tell us all again, when did you first get into collecting?
1989, I went to Chicago with my family, not only to see Chicago, but I found out there was a national convention. I believe it was at the basement of a hotel, and I don't remember the name of it, but maybe it was the Holiday Inn. And went down the escalator, and of course, who had the first booths, the best? Al Rosen and Bill Mastro.
Mm-hmm.
And so going downstairs at the hotel, and I look around and I see all this stuff that I've never seen. We never had Babe Ruth bats from Denver, Colorado. I never heard of Bowman Card Company. So it was eye opener.
Mm-hmm.
And so I bought a few things, and I really loved baseball. I collected as a child, and just to shorten it, I got hooked.
What's interesting is, so you got into it right at a period in time when the popularity of the hobby was peaking. The attendance at those nationals, and I think Anaheim was a couple of years after that, where they had at that time set the all-time attendance record, which held all the way until this past year, when this past year's Chicago show finally broke the all-time attendance record that Anaheim had, I believe, in 1991. So you were getting into it right at the time that it was peaking. Then there were some quieter times, right, in the hobby. Attendance at nationals went down. There weren't as many collectors as you went on throughout the 90s and the 2000s. Now we're back in a huge growth period, record-setting period again. But you've collected all throughout. You didn't just get in the late 80s and then leave. You got in and you got hooked, and you've been consistent about building your collection now, for the last 35 years.
Well, I think you pointed out there are 4 stages to the lifetime of this business of collecting sports cards. The first is before my time, when older guys would go to someone's house. They had a little trade magazine, a little pulp trade magazine, and they would trade. And, they would trim cards to make them look nicer. I think a Wagner card might have been $100, which nobody had. So then it developed around 1989. That show was sort of the beginning of a greater interest. So that's the second stage. That's when I got into it. Then I think, like you said, it dropped down in the third stage from the late 90s till about 2008. It was steady up and down, but didn't move much. And then I think we can talk about it later. Certain things happened in the auction business and the internet that has caused us to have a memorabilia and sports cards that are for wealth managers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's an investment. Plus, it's those that invest also enjoy the history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Joe, you joined PSA, I believe, in 1999.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah,
so
August of 99. Yeah.
So just slightly after some of the stories that Marshall was telling right there, what was the landscape like for grading when you joined in 99?
It was a bit chaotic when I joined, because that was the first time, it was around the first time where it really started to gain traction. So an interesting statistic, which I've shared with people before, is from 1991, when PSA opened its doors, to 1998, they had graded a total of roughly 1 million cards in that time. But from 1998 forward, they never graded less than 1 million cards a year. So it combination of the .com boom, the McGuire-Sosa home run chase, the emergence of platforms like eBay and auction houses, as Marshall mentioned, things were changing, access was increasing. And so it really started to gain traction at that time. So when I came on board, it was when things were kind of rising aggressively for the first time.
Yeah. Interesting. And was the sentiment changing? The people who, maybe throughout the 90s pushed back on it, and some of the dealers who said this is never going to catch on and we're not going to support this. At what point did they all kind of see that the train was leaving the station, and maybe they flipped to become more supportive of it?
Yeah, so I was, as a collector, I was one of the early supporters of PSA in the early 1990s. And it wasn't until enough collectors kind of said, look, I'm not going to buy that unless it's graded or it's guaranteed to come back from PSA. Because up until that point, as Marshall alluded to earlier, when you go back to the 1980s, when there was this big explosion in the hobby, the control was with the seller. There was an inherent conflict of interest. I'm selling you the card. I'm also rendering the grade of the card. And for those of us who were active during the 1980s, we all probably have a few war stories to share, some bad moments where you buy something thinking it was this and it turned out to be that. And so it took a while. In the 1990s, there was a lot of pushback early on, because in order for third-party grading to take off, the dealer community, the auction house community needed to embrace it, accept it, and promote it as well. But once that happened, once the prices realized started to show up, and you saw that in that burst from the late 90s into the early 2000s, where a graded card was starting to sell for a lot more than an ungraded card, that's when I think everyone realized this is best for the long-term health of the industry.
Yeah, fascinating. When you started with PSA, what role did you start in?
So my first, they hired me in part to be a grader, but my first official role was sports content editor and manager. Okay. So it was more about content and information, articles, guides, that sort of thing. And then that gradually evolved over the next few years until I started running the division in 2002.
2002. So is that when you started running the grading division in 2002, and you did that all the way up until when you left the company just a few years ago?
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a long run, and it was a fun run, and just to watch it blossom and things change in the industry, it was really rewarding.
And of course, you were there leading as well through the whole COVID crunch. That must have been, was that the most wild time in the entire history, or was it the early stages? What would you say was the most crazy?
Nothing compares to that, because no one had a game plan. No, there was no blueprint to handle a pandemic if you're running a business, especially a collectibles business. Now, I can tell you, early in COVID, when it first hit, I used to write a column for the website and for our magazine. And I wrote this column. It was a very short piece, but basically saying, look, the hobby is incredibly resilient. We've been through a lot of other tough periods before. I think we'll get through this just like every other period, just hang in there, be patient. And I remember at first I received a lot of flack. Like, what do you mean? This is a pandemic. This is different. Now, none of us could have predicted that it went exactly the other direction, which it completely surged in a way that no one could have predicted. I mean, including me. I didn't think it was going to do that. But it really was incredible to watch how resilient this industry is. And I think that's where the passion comes in. I mean, financial crisis of 2008, the hobby kept going. After 9/11, the hobby kept going. Through all of these periods, you go all the way back. It just finds a way to persevere. And that's because people love to do this. And that passion doesn't go away regardless of what's going on in the world around us. So that was, to your point, that was the wildest situation.
Sure, it
and
probably
era.
gave you a little bit of gray hair, I
Oh,
imagine.
yeah. I mean, we were all trying to
Yeah.
figure out how to handle this
Yeah.
on the fly. I mean, not just in the hobby, of course, in the world, personally and professionally, but it was an amazing time.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. Marshall, why were you one of the early adopters of grading? And I know that it ties into the mantle you bought a little bit as well, because you ended up with the nicest copy of that 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle known to exist.
I think that it's a little bit of who I am. I'm very organized, and I could see. Look, the first card I ever bought in 1989 International was the 53 Mantle, and it was trimmed. So that's a good start for me to realize this isn't going anywhere. I'm getting, I mean, I didn't know at the time. So I was buying a lot of cars, and Bill Mastro was at the second Sotheby's. This is the time um, on the second show, and he heard about me. He's sitting up in the gallery with the VIPs. I'm down in the pit. He wanted to meet me because he knew I was, as they called me, a whale in the ocean. And so he comes down with a couple guys, and he says, I want to see what you're doing. So he comes to Denver, and I'm laying out all these Cracker Jack cards, and he says, well, you really are dumb, aren't you? Bill, this sounds just like him. Well, you're really dumb. Your cards are all trimmed. And he's right. So I sued the dealers under the long arm statute. I'm the first to go after them. And, because I wasn't going to get taken like that. And so that background, Geoff, has sort of led me to believe that if we don't clean it up, it's going to get worse. So when David Hall came to me, now that you know what I had went through, I knew that there had to be something done about this whole industry. And, one thing I learned, anywhere there's money, there's fraud. I mean, there are guys that can fix cards. I mean, they can paint a Mona Lisa, and you can't tell whether it's their Leonardo da Vinci or not. There's guys out there that are pretty good, even on modern cards. They trim them. So I think, to Joe's credit, as time went on, they were able to find more experienced people to detect, like a 33 Gaudi has a matrix on, and whether the matrix is right. So over time, it became more important. Do I agree with everything the graders do? Nobody does. We always want better than we get, but that's human nature. But I think Joe had a lot to do with refining the grading service, and also the half numbers, 7.5, 8.5. And nobody ever thought about that. But that, again, creates a marketplace. So I think the question is also, what's going to happen to all this? It's very difficult to get good stuff. And my view of it is, most of the good stuff is out there. There's only so many Matisses and Renoirs and Abraham Lincoln documents. Well, there's only so many 8s, 9s, and 10s. And they're in strong hands of people that don't want to sell like they used to. Gosh, I could make $5,000 on this and flip it. They're keeping it. So it's drying up. But on the other hand, it's also increasing the value of the good stuff, because we all know where it is. There's no more grandma finds. Eventually, it's becoming an art form. A 33 Gaudi in an 8, the red one, sold for $390,000, because there's not a lot of them. And so I think, as a collector, it's becoming an art form. Secondly, I think baseball is really the key over football and basketball and so on. It has a sustainability, and the reason it does is because Ruth, Garrick, Matheson, Colfax, Mantle, They're part of our history. They're part of American history, Americana. We're trying to hold on to that through collecting these images because nobody can relate to these new players because they're not characters. They weren't there as America was building a national game. They aren't integrated into American life as we knew it. So I think when people buy a Babe Ruth card or a Sandy Koufax card or Hank Aaron, Satchel Paige, there's a history, either civil rights or some historical event, like Babe Ruth hitting a home run when nobody could do it. So I think auction houses are going to have a harder time getting stuff. And the way they can get stuff out of guys that hold on to it are three ways: bankruptcy, divorce, and death. And when they happen, these guys all hope to get the collection.
Well, the fact that people don't want to give it up as much also means that it keeps prices strong. It keeps prices going up, which is
that I do.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. Let's talk about auction houses a little bit, because obviously, Joe, that's where you are today. What's your role right now with Heritage?
I have been described as a kind of a Swiss Army knife, so I do a little bit of everything. So I provide content, I write guides, articles. Obviously, look, we're an auction house, as we've been talking about. So working with consigners, working with bidders, working in the operation, marketing, and then also working on some new projects, new services that we're going to unveil in 2024, which maybe we'll talk about in a future video. But have a lot of different things going on. But it's been great because I like being involved in a variety of things.
Yeah. That's really, really neat. So I'm curious how auction houses have evolved throughout this whole process. Marshall, you told me some stories in the past. I don't know if they've made them onto our previous videos or not, but you told me some stories about when you would go to these auctions live. You referenced that a couple of times so far in this video as well, but you talked about how kind of what that environment was like, and or doing the phone bidding like you did on, I believe you won your big mantle card through phone bidding, right?
Yes.
And that's a lot different than how things are done today. So tell us a little bit about that earlier days of auctions, and then I'm curious to transition to get Joe's perspective on kind of where auction houses are today.
Well, let's see. If we go back to the 90s, period number 2, after 89, and Bill Masters, he said, "Can you help me out because he had the first major phone auction." So we had a board in a shopping center that was vacant, and they rented space, and there were a board with hooks on them, little hooks, round little hooks, and we had paper. So if Jeff Wilson called and said, "I want to bid $200 on a Clemente card," I'd write your bidder number down, and there's a hole in the piece of paper, and I'd put it on the hook. And so when someone called and said, "What's the bid on the Clemente card?" I'd say $30, make it 35, and I'd write his bidder number down and put it on the hook in the shopping center, which was probably in the most dangerous area in Chicago. I don't know how I got out of there. And, it was like, it made SCD, showing us putting paper on hooks. And so then Bill said, "You know what? I'm going to own it all." This is how he talks. "I'm going to own every newspaper, every auction house. I'm going to gobble up the world. I'm going to be the king." And he started, with his auction book. And it was beautiful. He did a good job with Sotheby's. So he and a guy named Steinbach started the Mastro auctions and launched this whole new concept. Well, because I was a whale in the ocean, I would go there and look at the stuff before the auction because I wanted to learn what it was. The card got a crease in it, see for myself. And then I would sit there during the auction and bid in the room. This is a private room. And so you don't do that anymore, do you? And it got to the point where I think Mastro was doing God, $10 million auctions. That's a lot of money back then. And uh, it took off from there. I mean, the internet and everything. So I think Joe, myself, David Hall, Alan Hager, Al Rosen, Bill Mastro, I may be missing a few. I think we were on the ship with Columbus when America was discovered, basically.
Yeah.
The pioneers, and there may be others, but listen, uh, if PSA didn't survive and under Joe's leadership, we'd be in desperate problems without uh, feeling comfortable with the grading service.
Yeah.
Which now today, I can speak for PSA. If you have a PSA card, what is there? 5 other grading services. I think Joe had a lot to do with giving it credibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And Joe, today, when you look at auctions today, obviously Heritage, you guys do a huge volume of auctions. Is it all about the internet? Is it all about the, live online bidding at this point?
Yeah, and I think I would say to younger collectors today that you have no idea how good you have it today compared to when you go back to the pre-internet days and just during the 80s and 90s when it went through that first explosion. There was no internet, so you were really limited in terms of access to the product, access to information. It's just such a better time to be a collector today, and just watching that evolution over the decades has been pretty amazing. But going back to your question about the auctions, yeah, I mean, I can remember just several years ago, even Heritage Sports was involved in live auctions. We would mix live auctions in with the internet only auctions, and I think what we realize, and I can say this as a collector. So let's say I was going to a live auction, and look, most of us have some budget, right? We can't, we can't empty the savings account every time we find things we like. So we have some budget. So we go into an auction, it's a live sale, and you kind of mark down which lots you're interested in. The problem in a live auction was once it moved past some lots that I may have been interested in, if I saved my ammunition for, let's say, lot 27, but I was interested in a couple of lots before that, and let's say I get outbid on lot 27, I can't pivot and go back. In a live sale, that's it. The hammer comes down, it's on to the next lot. What the internet auctions allow for, and this is obviously the common practice for all platforms today, it enables the bidders to pivot. They feel like, okay, these couple of lots are going out of range for me. I can now pivot and move over to these other lots. So it sort of keeps the action going and gives bidders an opportunity to still participate and to still come away with something when certain lots have gone out of their range.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I never thought about how that would have been back then. I'm only used to bidding today, and that absolutely happens. I do that all the time. I'll flag 6 or 7 different items that I've got interest in and put them on my watch list, and then I'll sit there and I'll bid on a few, I'll bid on all of them, and then I'll start to see a couple of them kind of get out beyond my range, and so then I'll concentrate my efforts on the others. Yeah. But it obviously didn't used to be that way. Different ball game back then for sure.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
I think what grading is also done, and I think the viewers need to understand, well, this is only an 8. I'll give you an example. In 1962, Topps made VIP sets, wrapped them up, beautiful box. And a dealer had about 6 or 7 of those sets from 62. And he opened them up at a show, and he let me go through them. I can tell you out of 600 and some odd cards at each set, you're lucky to find 30 that could make the grade of 8. 1953, I had a fellow come to my house. His father never did anything with a 53 set. They still had a bend in them. He put them in a box, never played with them. Every one of them was off center. And so I just think people ought to realize these cards were cut in sheets, they just guillotined them and they didn't care. So what's happening now is this, since you can't take for granted an 8 because they're not easy. Now people are thinking a 5 and a 6 isn't so bad because What it's done is it made things more expensive and more in demand instead of less. So getting back to when I said the good stuff is in strong hands and guys don't need to sell it because they don't need the money, the plethora of cards that are 5 and 6 are all over the place, and now people like them. So I think, in a sense, even though the market is difficult for the higher end cards, when you talk about the vintage market, it's on fire because these cards now are coming worthwhile that are ex-Smith, that are nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's very different when in the early days of grading, 1990s, early 2000s, a lot of the talk and a lot of the energy was all around high end. It was high end, high end, high end. And then what people found over time, and this is part of the evolution, part of the sophistication of collectors and how discerning they've become. You can find T206s and 2s, 3s, and 4s. Yes, they have technical flaws. Obviously, that's why they're in those grades. But they have beautiful eye appeal, great colors, great centering. Same thing with Gaudi's, same thing with play ball. So people started to realize, look, as the high-end market got away from them and got away from their budget, you can still find really beautiful cards in some of those lower to mid grades if you're discerning, because not, as Marshall said earlier, not every 5, not every 6, not every 7 is the same. And that is part of how the industry continues to evolve. Collectors are recognizing that, and they're paying premiums for cards that have extraordinary eye appeal for the grade.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Marshall, tell me about that experience of buying your 52 Mantle and that experience that day of buying that at auction.
Well, I never knew about the 52 Mantle, that particular one, because I later found out that, there are 2 types of 52 Mantles. One with a line under the box, that's a type 2. One without a line, just type 1. So the Rosenfind was type 1s, no line under it. Mine comes from a pack, according to the architect that bought it in a card shop. Well, his name was Murphy, and he decided to go to Wolfer's auction in San Francisco, sell the set ungraded with that Mantle card for $250 minimum bid. Nobody bought it. So
wow, so $250,000
for the whole set.
Could have got you the entire set of 1952 Topps, including the world's best copy of the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle card.
Correct.
Wow.
So Dwayne Garrett owned Wolfer's auction, and he had it. So it turns out Bill Hughes, dealer, got a hold of David Hall, and David Hall bought a bunch of those cards. They broke up the set. He paid $50,000 for that Mantle card and a few other cards. So David Hall comes to Denver. I had a pool table, and he brings some of the cards that he bought from Bill Hughes that was part of the set, not the Mantle, though. And Charlie Merkel from Mississippi, another big collector, he comes because we all agreed that David Hall would buy as many commons as and we'd all chip in. Then we'd come to my house and lay them all on the pool table, and we'd like I'd be the first 2, 3, then 2, 3, 1, and so we divided up the commons.
You did like a draft, essentially, of all the commons.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a
Like
fantasy
you
football
guys-
draft.
Yeah, 1952 Topps.
You
Incredible.
guys call it a break.
Yeah,
you guys.
it was.
We
It
were
was kind
doing
of a
breaks
break. Kind of a
on
break.
pool tables in my basement of my home with Charlie Merkel and David Hall. And I remember we all thought George Mekovich in the set was the hardest card. Everybody wanted the George Mekovich card. Like, you don't even know who he is, right?
No, I don't.
So then 96 comes around, and David decides to sell the card. Well, it turns out it goes up for auction. David's on the phone. David has a very aggressive personality, to say the least. And so I'm on, well, Marshall, it's at 40,000. He's got the other He's holding the phone, and he's got the other phone. Well, this guy's bid 50,000. What do you want to do? You only got 30 seconds. He's hustling me. All right, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. It's 100,000. I don't have that kind of money. But it turns out at 121,000, I told David that's it. But he's got a grocer from New York who doesn't even collect baseball cards, but happened to see it at a display at his show. And at 121, and David says, "What do you want to do?" He's talking to the grocer. I said, "David, put the hammer down." I used an expletive, just get it over with because that's it. 121,000. And I since talked, I said, I want to talk to the grocer to make sure I wasn't shill bidded. And I called him, and we became friends kind of over the years, not a lot. He talked to me once in a while. Then SCD writes an article. This dumb idiot, Marshall Fogel, doesn't know what he's doing. Paid over $100,000 for a post-war card. Well, now they're calling me wisely eccentric.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, as Joe has written about, that mine is the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
It's you've seen the card.
Oh, beautiful. Incredible copy.
It's like something special about it. It's just the color, the contrast. I don't know. It's just like he was made in heaven. It's just that special. How lucky was I? Lucky, wasn't I?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't know 25 years later it was going to be the best card,
Yep.
and I'm very proud to own it. And so, you know what? The real story is I gambled with this collection. Nobody thought this would ever be worth the money that you spend on it. So I took a risk. A lot of us took risks that spent a lot of money. And because of the industry maturing and because of authentication and credibility, this stuff becomes important.
So that's a great place to wrap up with this final question. As you just said, Marshall, we've created a monster, right? You guys especially, and the two of you and many of the other names you mentioned today that have built the hobby to where it is today. What does it look like going forward? Where do you think this all continues to go? Do we have bright days ahead? Do we have lean days ahead? What might this look like as this continues? Joe, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm bullish about it because I've watched this over my entire lifetime and going through ups and downs and challenging times. And again, it goes back to the ability to persevere. There's sports and sports history and collecting. It's part of DNA, at least for some people. I have it, Marshall has it, you have it. That's not going away. So the industry may change. And I think that what we're going to see is further sort of sophistication on the buyer's part. I think they've become more and more discerning.
Mm-hmm.
I think certain categories in the hobby are going to start catching up a little bit more. Look, cards is where most of us start in our childhood. We start with cards. There's more information about card collecting than any other segment of the sports collectibles hobby. Some of the other categories, game used, vintage photos, tickets, autographs, these things are catching up in terms of information. And the more information that we can provide buyers with, the more apt they are to open their wallets and feel comfortable about jumping in. So I think there's a very bright future as we introduce, again, more collectors to the categories and introduce more information to increase peace of mind for more buyers out there. I think you'll see some of these other categories continue to progress. Of course, always led by the sports card hobby.
Right. Fascinating. I love that perspective. How about you, Marshall?
Well, the way I see it is you got vintage cards and vintage memorabilia, bats, uniforms, pins, all kinds of letters, baseballs. So they're two separate subjects. Let's take the modern market. Like Mike Trout every time he goes up to the plate, he sells a bat. So there's tons of them. That's not a bad thing. You want to buy a Tony Gwynn uniform, you won't have any trouble. I mean, so a lot of these players today have changed the market because they have agents and they know they're making money off of volume if they're a great player. So in the modern card market, where it started, with 1-on-1, 100 of 100, pretty soon they were making too much of it. So I think the good thing about the modern market, whether it's cards or memorabilia, is it'll become affordable for the younger generation. I think it's a good thing that the market of modern cards and modern memorabilia has become more affordable, because that draws more people in to the business. And then when they get hooked on their collection, which is more of a hobby collection, they're going to want the vintage, the art. I call it the artwork.
Yeah.
The real Joe DiMaggio uniform. So it's all good. You start out buying a Honda, and when you have enough money, you want to buy a Lincoln.
Yeah.
So I think that's the analogy I use. And I know you're opening up a store in Atlanta, and to me, that's a great thing, because you're appealing to a volume of younger people that someday are going to want to collect what we have as, master collectors. I agree with Joe overall. It's just going to be better.
Yeah.
And, that store you're opening, I must comment on it. It's the first high-end store to sell cards. You have a break room. You've got a podcast room. I mean, I call you the Gucci store of baseball.
And my wife would appreciate that.
And to me, that it shouldn't go unsaid how important that is. From the little store off an avenue, and it's got wooden shelves, and it's just, this, you're taking it to another level. Why is that important? Because when you take this whole conversation about the future of the market, you cannot ignore the future of the retail market. And what you're doing is a pioneer in something that's going to make it even better, Geoff.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Really, really excited. And I love hearing your perspective on that. I appreciate it. Marshall, Joe, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today. I know our audience who's listened to this, I'm sure they've gotten a ton out of it. It's been a lot of fun chronicling the history of the hobby with both of you.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Geoff.
Absolutely. And for everybody watching, I want to remind you that these full-length episodes, the videos are available on YouTube under The Geoff Wilson Show. And then it's also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, a great way to listen to the show on the go. Make sure you are subscribed everywhere. Appreciate you, gentlemen. Appreciate you guys for watching, and we'll see you soon in our next episode. Take care.